Alexander Pierce Whitmore raised his champagne, smiling for the cameras, every gesture rehearsed, every glance calculated. The room was his, high-ceilinged crystal chandeliers, the kind of wealth that made people nod and envy in equal measure. And then he saw her, Tiana Knight. She stood near the edge of the terrace, backlit by the city lights, wearing a gown that demanded attention, unapologetic, precise, impossible to ignore. She wasn't supposed to be here. Not at his $5,000 a plate gala. Not in his world anymore. "Who's that?" Vivienne whispered, her diamond bracelet catching the light as her fingers trembled over Alexander's sleeve. "No one," Alexander said too quickly, voice tight. "Just someone from before." But Tiana wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were fixed on a man moving through the crowd with the kind of quiet authority that silenced the room. Min Yi Hyun, chairman of the Hanel Syndicate, the Black Phoenix, walking past Wall Street elites, past paparazzi, past everyone who mattered, and stopped in front of Tiana as if she were the only person in the world. Alexander felt it then, the first crack in his empire. 4 years ago, Tiana had been the hidden genius behind his logistics algorithms. He had taken her code, erased her name, erased her from the story, convinced himself that brilliance could be bought and sold. And now she was here, with the one man who recognized her worth and the power to expose the empire Alexander had built on her back. The champagne trembled in his hand. The applause sounded distant. And in that instant, Alexander realized he was no longer the one holding power. Do want to see what happens when power, betrayal, and revenge collide? Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Tiana's story is just getting started, and you won't want to miss a single twist. The gala was a masterpiece of manufactured prestige, a high-society fortress of glass and gold, where Alexander Pierce Whitmore felt invincible. He stood at the center of a circle of venture capitalists, the air thick with the smell of expensive cologne and the hum of Wall Street's elite. He had just finished a joke about disruptive logistics when the heavy doors at the far end of the ballroom swung open. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Alexander's champagne glass stayed frozen against his lower lip. Tiana Knight stepped into the light. For a moment, the world Alexander had built, the patents, the press releases, the singular founder narrative, began to flicker like a dying bulb. She was draped in a midnight silk gown that caught the amber glow of the chandeliers. She didn't look like the woman he had discarded. She looked like the storm he had spent 4 years pretending wouldn't come. Beside her stood Min Yi Hyun. The chairman of the Hanel Syndicate didn't merely walk. He claimed the space around him with a lethal, unhurried grace. As they moved deeper into the room, Yi Hyun didn't look at the senators or the cameras. His focus remained entirely on Tiana. His hand rested possessively, yet with a strange, deep-seated respect just above the small of her back. It wasn't the touch of a man showing off a trophy. It was the shield of a king guarding his most valuable asset. "Alexander, you've gone pale," Vivienne whispered, her fingers tightening on his arm. He barely heard her. His heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He watched the Black Phoenix lean down to whisper something into Tiana's ear. Tiana smiled, a small, sharp expression that never reached the man she used to call her husband. The chemistry between them was immediate and protective. It was an unbreakable wall of silent communication that made Alexander feel like a trespasser at his own party. As Yi Hyun led her toward the terrace, his eyes finally swept across the room. He briefly caught Alexander's gaze. There was no anger in the chairman's expression. There was only a clinical, terrifying indifference, the look of a man who had already identified the flaw in the structure. He was simply waiting for the right moment to pull the thread. Alexander realized then that Tiana hadn't just returned to reclaim her name. She had brought the only man in New York capable of helping her burn his legacy to the ground. 4 years ago, the empire wasn't a skyscraper. It was a drafty warehouse in Brooklyn that smelled of burnt coffee and the electric hum of overworked servers. Tiana Knight sat at a dented metal desk, her fingers flying across a keyboard as she mapped out the logic of a world that didn't yet exist. Behind her, Alexander stood by the single window, staring out at the rain and the gray skyline of a city that hadn't noticed them yet. He was the face, the charisma, and the voice, but Tiana was the marrow and the bone of the operation. She was building the architecture of hope, a predictive engine designed to turn logistical chaos into a seamless, profitable dance. "It's beautiful, Alex," she whispered, her eyes reflected in the lines of glowing green code. "The patterns are finally holding. It's not just moving boxes, it's anticipating where the boxes need to be before the customer even clicks buy." Alexander turned away from the window, a predatory light in his eyes that Tiana mistook for pride. He walked over and placed his hands on her shoulders, his touch heavy and warm. "No, Tiana," he said, his voice smooth and full of the gravity he would later use to seduce investors. "It's more than beautiful. It's a gold mine. This is the singular vision I've been talking about." As Tiana spent her nights submerged in the mathematical elegance of the engine, Alexander spent his days building a different kind of structure, the lie. He practiced his pitches in front of the warehouse's cracked mirrors, slowly editing Tiana out of the narrative. He started saying, "my breakthrough instead of our work, and my innovation instead of the team's discovery." He convinced himself that the world, and the racist venture capitalists he courted, would never bet on a black woman's genius, but they would drown a white man in capital if he looked the part of a visionary. Tiana didn't see the erasure happening. She was too busy perfecting the flow patterns, believing that their marriage was the ultimate partnership. She saw the warehouse as a cocoon for their future, unaware that Alexander was already weaving a web where she was merely the hidden power source, and he was the only one allowed to stand in the sun. While she built the engine that would change the industry, he was building the cage that would one day try to contain her. The morning of the first major investor pitch, the air in their small Brooklyn warehouse felt electric with the scent of cheap coffee and expensive hope. Tiana stood backstage, her hands trembling slightly as she made a final adjustment to Alexander's silk tie. Her laptop was already connected to the main projector. Loaded with the complex architecture she had spent months perfecting, the diagrams, the predictive flow models, and the code that breathed life into their dream. "You ready?" she whispered, her voice thick with the shared weight of their struggle. "We're ready," Alexander replied. His voice was steady, practiced, and devoid of the warmth they usually shared in the quiet hours of the night. But when the lights dimmed and the prestigious panel of venture capitalists leaned forward in their leather chairs, Alexander didn't reach for her hand. Instead, he straightened his blazer and stepped through the curtain alone. Tiana froze in the shadows of the wings, her heart stuttering. She waited for the cue to join him, for the moment he would introduce his partner, the architect of the system. It never came. "Good morning," Alexander's voice boomed, filling the room with a curated, effortless confidence. "I'm Alexander Pierce Whitmore, and I'm about to show you the future of logistics. I've spent the last year developing a singular solution to a global crisis." Tiana went very still as the first slide appeared. It was her architecture, her breakthrough, but her name was nowhere to be found. Every "we" had been surgically replaced with "I," every reference to their partnership had been erased. After the pitch, she cornered him in the sterile, fluorescent hallway of the office building. "What happened in there, Alex? Why didn't you mention me?" Alexander didn't look at her. He was busy checking his phone for the first wave of investor feedback. "We killed it, Tiana. They're interested. Real money is on the table." "But you said it was your breakthrough," she pressed, her voice cracking. "I built that entire system, you know I did." He sighed, finally looking at her with a patronizing pity that felt like a slap. "Tiana, look at this room. Look at who holds the checks. These investors don't bet on committees, and they don't bet on partnerships that complicate the brand. They bet on a singular vision, one face, one story." His words were a coded dismissal, a sharp reminder that he believed her black face would be a liability to the optics of a billion-dollar company. He was telling her that her genius was a work product to be hidden in the basement while he stood in the light. In that moment, the architecture of hope she had built began to feel like the bars of a very expensive cage. The erasure was not a sudden strike, but a slow, calculated theft of identity. Over the following months, Alexander grew more distant. his presence in the warehouse replaced by long meetings with lawyers and branding consultants who never asked for Tiana's input. While she sat in the dim glow of her monitors, refining the algorithms that were now processing millions of data points, Alexander was busy perfecting the legal wall he was building between Tiana and her own genius. One rainy Tuesday, Tiana arrived at the office before the sun had fully breached the Brooklyn skyline. The warehouse was silent, save for the hum of the servers. On Alexander's desk sat a thick courier envelope, its seal broken. Driven by a cold nod of intuition, she pulled out the documents. They were patent applications, the primary legal filings for the adaptive flow engine she had bled for. She flipped to the signature page, her breath hitching in the quiet room. Alexander Pierce Whitmore was listed as the primary and sole inventor. Her name was nowhere. Not as a co-inventor, not as a contributor. She had been legally scrubbed from her own creation. She stood there in the gray dawn, the paper trembling in her hand, realizing that the man who kissed her every night was the same man who was systematically murdering her career. He hadn't just stolen her work. He had stolen her future, believing that her black face was a complication to his billion-dollar narrative. When Alexander walked in 2 hours later, smelling of rain and expensive espresso, he found her sitting at the kitchen table with the folder open. He didn't flinch. He didn't apologize. He simply set his coffee down and sighed, a patronizing sound that made her stomach turn. "It's standard procedure, Tiana," he said, his voice smooth and devoid of guilt. "The company holds the IP. I'm listed because I'm the CEO. It's what the board expects to see for the Series C funding." "I built this, Alexander," she said, her voice a low, dangerous vibration. "I wrote the lines, I solved the logic, and you buried me." "I protected us," he countered, stepping closer. "Investors want a singular vision. They want the face they can trust on a magazine cover. This is business." "No," Tiana said, standing up with a calm that terrified him more than any scream. "This is a betrayal. You didn't just want a singular vision, Alex. You wanted a world where I didn't exist. I want a divorce." The word hit the room like a physical blow. For the first time, the mask of the confident mogul slipped, revealing the panicked man underneath. But Tiana was already gone, her mind already moving toward the one thing Alexander had forgotten. She was the one who knew how the engine really worked, and she knew exactly how to hide a poison pill in the wreckage of their life. The divorce mediation was a sterile affair, held in a conference room that felt more like a tomb than a place of resolution. Alexander sat across from Tiana, flanked by Daniel Hargrove, a man whose expensive suit and silver hair signaled a career built on safe bets and administrative dominance. Alexander looked bored, checking his watch every few minutes as if Tiana's life were a nuisance to his schedule. He wanted this over. He wanted the mess of his past cleared away so he could present his pristine, singular image to the next round of investors. Tiana played her part with terrifying precision. She sat with her shoulders slightly slumped, her voice soft and hesitant, a perfect imitation of a woman who had finally been broken by the machine. When Hargrove pushed the thick stack of settlement papers toward her, she didn't look at Alexander. She looked at the desk, her eyes seemingly tired. "I just want it to be over, Alex," she whispered. Hargrove smiled, a patronizing, thin-lipped expression. "We've been very generous, Tiana. The cash settlement is more than fair for a supporting role in the early stages." He hadn't even bothered to read the technical addendums Tiana's own quiet, junior lawyer had inserted into Section 7. To Hargrove, it looked like standard boilerplate language regarding future auditing rights. Dull, dense, and irrelevant to a company that, on paper, was still just a promising startup. Tiana flipped to the back of the document. Deep within subsection C of Section 7, she had buried the poison pill. It was a contingent equity trigger, a piece of legal code as elegant as the software she had written. It stated that in the event of any single capital injection exceeding $50 million, the architect of record would be granted an automatic 18% equity stake to prevent dilution of the original intellectual foundation. Because Alexander had filed the patents in his name only, Hargrove assumed Alexander was the only architect. He didn't realize that the internal development logs, the ones Tiana still held, legally defined her as the sole creator. Alexander watched her sign, his smirk widening. He thought he was watching her sign away her rights. He didn't see the steady hand or the way her eyes sharpened for a fraction of a second as the ink met the paper. He saw a defeated wife. He didn't see the founder reclaiming her throne. As she handed the pen back, Tiana felt a cold, familiar spark of power. She had just handed Alexander a ticking clock, and he was too arrogant to hear the ticking. She walked out of the room without a backward glance, leaving the mogul and his complacent lawyer to celebrate a victory that was already turning into ash. The meeting took place in the silent, glass-walled library of a private club, far from the prying eyes of the Wall Street tabloids. Tiana sat by the window, watching the rain streak the glass, until the heavy doors opened and Min Yi-hyun entered. He didn't look like a man who dealt in shadows. He looked like a man who dealt in truth. He sat across from her, placing a leather-bound tablet on the table between them. On the screen was a block of code, her code stripped down to its core logic. "I didn't find you because of your name, Tiana," Yi-hyun began, his voice a calm, resonant hum that seemed to steady the air. "I found you because of your fingerprints. I spent 6 months tracking the architecture of Whitmore Logistics. I wanted to see the mind that could solve the bottleneck problem with such surgical precision." Tiana looked at the screen, her heart skipping a beat. It was the predictive engine from the warehouse days, the one Alexander claimed was his singular breakthrough. "Alexander is a salesman," Yi-hyun continued, his unreadable eyes softening as they met hers. "Salesmen are sloppy. They understand the pitch, but they don't understand the soul of the machine. He tried to rewrite the headers to hide your work, but he didn't realize that math has a signature. The way you nest your loops, the way you handle variables, it's like a dialect. It's elegant, it's honest, and it's completely inconsistent with the man who claims he invented it." He leaned forward, his presence commanding yet strangely comforting. "I've spent my life identifying value, Tiana, not the performance of it, but the substance. I was half in love with this engine long before I knew your face. When I realized Alexander had buried the real architect to protect his optics, I knew I had to find you." Tiana felt a lump form in her throat. For years, Alexander had told her that her mind was a work product, and her face was a liability. Yet here was a man who had traveled across an ocean because he recognized her worth in a string of numbers. "He thinks he's celebrating a victory tonight," Yi-hyun said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "He doesn't realize that he just accepted a $65 million investment from my firm. An investment that, according to a very specific clause in your divorce papers, triggers a massive redistribution of power." He reached out, his hand hovering near hers on the table. "I don't just want to fund a company, Tiana. I want to restore a legacy. Are you ready to stop being a ghost?" Tiana looked at his hand, then back at the code on the screen. For the first time in 4 years, she didn't feel like a tool being used. She felt like a founder. "I'm ready," she whispered. "Let's show them what real architecture looks like." The main stage of the gala was bathed in a soft, celebratory blue light, a podium prepared for Alexander's grand announcement. He stepped toward the microphone, adjusting his cuffs, the image of a man who had finally conquered the world. "Tonight isn't just about growth," Alexander began, his voice projecting that practiced, singular confidence. "It's about the vision that started in a small warehouse 4 years ago. The breakthrough that The massive digital screen behind him flickered, cutting off his words. Instead of the polished corporate sizzle reel Alexander expected, the screen filled with grainy, high-resolution photographs of old, stained whiteboards. The room went silent. These weren't professional diagrams. They were raw, frantic scribbles of complex algorithms, dated 3 years prior. In the corner of every board, written in a distinct, elegant cursive, was the signature, T-Night. Alexander froze, his mouth hanging open. A second image flashed, a video log from the original warehouse server. It showed Tiana, her face tired but focused, explaining the logic of the predictive engine to a camera she thought was for their personal archives. "The flow isn't linear, Alex," her voice echoed through the ballroom speakers, clear and undeniable. "I've solved the bottleneck. This is the heart of the system. A murmur rippled through the crowd like a rising tide. Investors leaned forward, their faces shifting from admiration to suspicion. Vivienne's hand dropped from Alexander's arm as she stared at the screen, her eyes wide with the realization that the genius she married was looking at the board like he'd never seen the math before. Yi Hyun stood at the edge of the stage, his silhouette sharp and immovable. He didn't say a word. He let the evidence do the screaming. The screen transitioned to a side-by-side comparison, Tiana's original handwritten code versus the patent Alexander had filed in his name. The surgical logic was identical, but the headers had been crudely overwritten. "This is a mistake," Alexander stammered into the dead microphone, his face turning a sickly, pale gray. "This is proprietary data that has been tampered with." But the data didn't lie. The handwriting didn't lie. The room watched in real time as the singular vision of Alexander Pierce Whitmore was dismantled, revealed to be nothing more than a stolen shadow of the woman standing beside the Black Phoenix. The corrective record was now playing for the world to see, and for the first time in his life, Alexander found himself with no script to follow. Tiana looked up at the screen, her expression calm and vindicated. She was no longer a ghost. She was the architect, and the world finally knew her name. The silence in the ballroom was heavy, broken only by the frantic, dying hum of the projector. Alexander stood at the podium, a man stripped of his skin, exposed as a thief in front of the very world he had tried to master. He looked toward Tiana, hoping for a flicker of the woman who used to be his support. But he found only a stranger standing in the shadow of a giant. Min Yi Hyun stepped forward, his presence closing the distance between them and the ruin Alexander had become. He didn't look at the cameras or the investors. His world had narrowed to the woman beside him. With a grace that felt like a final, decisive move on a chessboard, Yi Hyun reached out and cupped Tiana's face. His touch was firm, a public declaration of an alliance that went deeper than equity or algorithms. As the elite of Wall Street watched in breathless shock, Yi Hyun leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't an impulse, it was strategy. It was the Black Phoenix claiming the true architect of the empire. When he pulled back, his thumb brushed her cheek, and his voice, though low, carried through the hushed room like a thunderclap. "You were 4 years overdue, Tiana," he murmured, his eyes locked on hers with a respect Alexander had never been capable of. "For a man who knows your value, for a man who doesn't need to hide the sun to feel warm." Alexander made a sound, a strangled, desperate protest, but Yi Hyun finally turned to face him. The chairman's expression was as cold and unreadable as a frozen sea. "You made a fatal error, Whitmore," Yi Hyun said, his voice cutting through Alexander's remaining dignity. "You mistook presentation for substance. You believed that if you polished the glass enough, no one would notice the structure was hollow. But I don't invest in glass. I invest in the mind that makes it." Yi Hyun turned back to Tiana, offering his arm with the courtly elegance of a king. "The 65 million has cleared, Alexander, and per Section 7, subsection C of the Knight Whitmore settlement, your former wife is now the second largest shareholder of this company. I suggest you start getting used to reporting to her." Tiana took his arm, her head held high, the poison pill she had planted years ago finally detonating in the center of Alexander's life. She didn't look back at the fallen mogul or his weeping wife. She walked toward the exit with the only man who had ever truly seen her, leaving Alexander Pierce Whitmore alone in the wreckage of his own singular lie. The heavy glass doors of the gala swung shut behind them, cutting off the frantic noise of the collapsing empire. The cold New York air hit Tiana's face like a benediction, sharp and clean, washing away the scent of expensive perfume and Alexander's desperation. On the sidewalk, a fleet of black sedans sat idling, their headlights cutting through the midnight mist. The city no longer felt like a labyrinth designed to hide her. It felt like a map she had finally mastered. Min Yi Hyun didn't let go of her hand. He pulled her closer, his thumb tracing slow, rhythmic circles against her palm, a silent promise that the protection he offered wasn't just corporate, but deeply, irrevocably personal. As they reached the lead vehicle, a tech journalist scrambled toward them, camera in hand. In the past, the flashes would have made Tiana flinch. Tonight she stood still, her silhouette merging with Yi Hyun's as he stepped slightly in front of her, shielding her from the glare while still letting her shine. "Ms. Knight," the journalist called out, his voice filled with a new, frantic respect. "Tiana Knight, is it true? Was the Whitmore engine your design from the beginning?" Tiana paused at the door of the sedan. She looked at the journalist, then at the man beside her. Yi Hyun wasn't looking at the cameras. He was looking at her with an intensity that made the cold air feel warm. For the first time in 4 years, the name she heard wasn't Mrs. Whitmore or a work product. It was her own. "The architecture has always been mine," Tiana said, her voice clear and unwavering. "Alexander just held the keys while I waited for someone who actually knew how to read the blueprint." Yi Hyun's eyes darkened with a pride that bordered on devotion. He leaned down, his lips brushing her temple in a gesture that was far softer than the strategic kiss inside. "They will never forget your name again," he whispered, his breath a warm contrast to the winter night. He ushered her into the leather sanctuary of the car, sliding in beside her as the door closed with a solid, final thud. The car pulled away from the curb, leaving the wreckage of the party and the fallen Mogul behind. In the dim light of the cabin, Yi Hyun didn't reach for his phone or a contract. He reached for her, pulling her hand to his lips and kissing her knuckles with a lingering, soulful heat. "Where to, Chairman?" the driver asked. Yi Hyun didn't take his eyes off Tiana. "Don't ask me," he said, his voice a low, intimate growl. "Ask the woman who owns the night." Tiana leaned her head against his shoulder, finally hearing the world say her name and feeling, for the first time, that she was exactly where she belonged. "To the warehouse," she said, a triumphant smile blooming on her lips. "I want to see the place where I was a ghost, now that I've finally come to life." As the car sped into the night, Tiana Knight didn't just have an empire. She had a king who knew she was the one truly wearing the crown. In the days that followed, Alexander was stripped of his title and buried in lawsuits while Vivienne fled to Paris to escape the scandal. Tiana rebranded the company to Knight Logistics, finally stepping into the sun as the true founder she had always been. The lesson is simple. True value isn't found in the person who takes the stage, but in the mind that makes the stage worth standing on. A stolen throne will always collapse when the person who actually built it comes back to take it. If you've ever felt overlooked while someone else took the credit, this victory is for you. Tap that subscribe button to join our community and never miss any of powerful stories where the unseen rise, truth wins, and respect is finally earned.